The 60s. A time of change, of fear, of anger. A time of challenge. "50 years later, a time of accelerated change.
Tired of being peaceful and tired of being calm.
Of more fear, more anger. A time for Challenge 2.0. Hello, and welcome to Challenge 2.0. Over the past 2 years, we've seen increasing anger, antagonism, even physical assaults. What's driving this behavior? Is it a trend? And if it is a trend, can it be reversed? And if so, how? Challenge 2.0 proposes to view these and other issues like it that are impacting life in this decade through the lens of faith. To that end, we're calling this episode From Me to We and From Them to Us. Well, a special welcome now to our 4 guests, all Seattle area faith leaders who have agreed to join us and share your perspectives, your wisdom. Rabbi Daniel Weiner of Temple to Her Sinai in Seattle, Pastor Terry Kyllo of Neighbors in Faith, Aneelah Afzali, who is the Executive Director of MAPS Amen, the American Muslim Empowerment Network, and Father William Treacy of the Tracy Levine Center. Thank you again so much for joining us. And I'm Jeff Renner. I'm simply here to moderate this, act as air traffic controller, if you will. When each of you agreed to join us, I asked you to sort of dig back, and probably the challenge is finding just one, but one instance that you think is iconic of the troubles we're facing as a country right now and that disturbs you. Rabbi, perhaps we could start with you first.
The thing that comes, unfortunately, first to mind is something that happened last spring in the aftermath of some defacing of signs outside of the Muslim Association of Puget Sound. Within a month or so after that, someone defaced one of the sacred walls of our old sanctuary with Holocaust-denying graffiti. And to me, that really was iconic of not only some significant changes in our broader culture, but just the notion that the Holocaust could be denied, and the perpetrator utilized the phrase fake history, which unfortunately echoes some of the rhetoric of our current president and administration. And for me, it really was just reflective of the fact that there is a newly empowered extremist element in our country that feels that it has license to do things that it was perhaps shamed into not doing previously.
Pastor Terry.
So I'll kind of go the other direction and go very, very small. So I was at an event a couple days ago with a group of 20 people in Anacortes, Washington, and this very beautiful, wonderful man with wonderful values who's cared for his wife through her Alzheimer's began to talk to me about how fearful he was about Muslims. And I won't repeat all the fears, but we've heard those same fears from the anti-Muslim hate groups across this country. And what they really did was use his own values, his own care for his family and his country, but misrepresented Muslims. And so kind of turned this very kind, loving man into a person so fearful that he could hardly hear anything I had to say. And so what was emblematic to me about that was that we have a whole lot of really good people who are, instead of learning about others by talking to the others, they're learning about other faith groups, other minority groups, through hate networks and through third parties that do not fairly represent them.
Aneelah.
Yeah. Thank you for having us. Certainly we've seen an increase in hate crimes against Muslims in our country, some of the highest levels in our nation's history. We've seen statistics that show an increase in 2015 of 67%, according to the FBI, of hate crimes against Muslims in our country. We have the Council on American Islamic Relations giving us numbers of something like over 90% increase in 2017 as well. So there has been this tremendous increase in these kinds of hate crimes, bigotry, discrimination, political rhetoric, and sadly, a lot of what we're seeing and hearing, particularly with the slurs and things like that, are things that we hear every day on mainstream media. And this is really the problem. And that kind of repetition, and when good people of conscience do not stand up and challenge that, we see the repercussions in people taking action, both in the individual acts of hate, and including, as Rabbi Daniel mentioned, at our own mosque, the Muslim Association of Puget Sound that I'm a part of, we had our sign, our mosque sign, vandalized twice in less than a month. And that is really, I mean, of course, we have a situation in Charlottesville and other examples around the country, but here locally, having that sign attacked, and the second time was caught on camera, somebody viciously and with just such anger and vehemence just attacking the sign, it really hurt at the gut level. So we're seeing that, and I know friends who have personally been attacked by people who have called them anti-Muslim slurs, and a lot of the things that we hear on mainstream media. So that's really sort of an example of the problem that we have going on right now, unfortunately.
Father Treacy, I'd ask you a two-part question, both an example like the others that sticks out in your mind, but you have an unusual perspective. The reason we call this Challenge 2.0 is there was a Challenge 1.0, and you were one of the founding guests on that, if you will. Does it seem like we've done a total relapse since the 60s? That was a time of a great deal of ferment. Or is there some reason for hope that perhaps this is not totally representative? What's your take on that?
I have both. I was raised in Ireland, and I have very little contact with Jews, very few Jews in Ireland. I met Rabbi Levine. I learned the terrible problems they faced in Europe, in Tsarist Russia and Europe. So we decided to start a TV program with the help of the Como TV and take up another problem at the time. Kennedy, a Catholic, was seeking to be president, and many Americans thought he'd be taking orders from the Pope, that America was in danger. But we addressed these problems at church and state and our attitude to the Jews. I feel we made some progress. A Catholic was elected, that problem doesn't arise anymore in regard to religion. And I think in regard to Jews, while there's still problems facing there, we had 300,000 people watch that program every week. So I think we made some progress in those areas. So I do see reason for hope that we do have to address problems in regard to race, in regard to Muslims, at the future, as we did those.
When you mentioned the 300,000, I can only hope that we have 300,000 that will be watching this as they get the opportunity. We've talked a little bit about the issue of has there been a total relapse or not. I'd like to ask the other three of you, what are your perspectives? What are your takes on that from where we were in the 60s and 70s?
I feel like we've made a lot of progress, which is wonderful, but we still are running across some of the same kinds of issues, same kinds of problems. Unfortunately, what we see happening is a backlash, in a sense, to some of the progress that's made. And we're also seeing different people, different groups of people being otherized. So today it's Muslims. In the past, it may have been Catholics or Jews or Japanese Americans or others. So we are seeing sort of that repetition of that script with different characters, unfortunately. And I think what's important is when we make that progress, we make it for everybody and make it clear that we will not allow for this kind of division to be created, because the sort of the targeted community, hopefully we will get over sort of the demonization that is occurring today with specific communities, just like we have in the past. But of course, we still have a long ways to go. We still have race problems in this country, as Father Treacy mentioned. So that is something we still have to address, and it's an ongoing issue in our country.
Terry?
So during the time when the Jim Crow laws were being put forward in the South, really a lot of African Americans and a lot of poor white Americans had a whole lot in common, but they were pitted against each other. Mm-hmm. And I feel that there's a lot of forces today for a host of different reasons who are pitting different people against each other. The fact is that we're in a time of incredible change, where automation is impacting the number of people able to work in manufacturing, and that automation is only going to speed up as 46% of the jobs in the United States are capable of being automated in the next 20 years. And so what we're talking about is a deep sense of anxiety in our larger population. And what we had, I fear, is a presidential candidate in this last election who became president, Donald Trump, who instead of evoking the real issues that are facing us in our economy, began to scapegoat Mexicans for taking our jobs, Muslims for making us unsafe, and the Chinese for taking our factories. And when you start to take your anxiety and you begin to force it or to focus it on groups that are vulnerable, that begins to unleash a kind of violence, both verbally and physically, that is very difficult to slow down once it begins. But I also see a tremendous amount of effort on the part of many different faith communities, leaders of all kinds, coming together and reaffirming our common humanity. And actually, I see this as an opportunity for us to deepen the kind of change that's going on, because ultimately, it's not about us versus them. We're all just human beings, and we've got to find a way to live together and to support each other in our basic needs and in our pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Daniel?
I mean, I concur with everything that's been said. I mean, the two extra points that I would add, one is that I think it's a bit deceptive to feel that the progress we've made, particularly with race since the civil rights era, somehow has closed the book on race in this country, or that having an African-American president somehow means that we're living in a post-racial society. We're not. If anything, the problems are more structural, sometimes more subtle, sometimes less. And I think we need to look at issues of race within a very different context than we did 50 years ago. And just to amplify, Terry, what you were saying before, I would love to see a politician, a potential presidential candidate, speak to the very unifying issues that you have enumerated, to speak to those elements of citizenship that we all share, to those elements of just what it is to exist with dignity and comfort and well-being and health and blessing. We need a presidential candidate who will speak in quasi-religious terms, but in ways that will focus upon the myriad ways in which we share common aspirations and common dreams. And I think what we're sorely needing is a politician who can lead us in that unifying way and kind of take us to the next level, hopefully a better level for what it is to be an American citizen.
Mm-hmm. As I look back 30, maybe even 20 years ago, most people in this country tended to get their news, their information, even their commentary from a couple of different sources. We had three basic networks and PBS. Those have splintered and multiplied almost to an uncountable number. The writer and editor Lewis Lapham said that Fear is now America's top-selling product, that it's available 24/7 as a cable channel or mobile app, and he was very blunt about this, in all the shades of the paranoid rainbow. Is that a fair statement? And how do you see that we can work with the reality of these many different sources of news and information to try to get some unification or ability to bridge these gaps?
My colleague on TV, Rabbi Levine, said a picture is worth 10,000 words. So take a picture. Jesus told us how to treat one another, be kind, give them drink to the thirsty, visit them in prison, and so on. One editorial in a local newspaper said, how come it takes a hurricane at Channel 4 to teach us how to treat each other? People volunteering to take people from rooftops and danger. So to me, if you can capture that spirit of Houston, for the pictures that you just see, without words, this is what we're called to do. That's my vision for the future. If we can have people capture that vision of what happened in Houston, what unfortunately happened in Florida this weekend, that's the vision I want to keep in mind.
Anyone else with an observation?
No, I mean, I agree with you that we are living in a very different time. Some said that if Nixon and Watergate had happened now, he wouldn't have had to resign and he wouldn't have been impeached, just because there would have been a whole other alternate media reality kind of bubble to defend him. I think it's a real challenge. We are so atomized, not only in what we imbibe from the media, but the sense of reality and perspective on reality that emerges from that. It's incredibly challenging. I mean, I know this is easier said than done, but what we need is somebody who bears a message which both is savvy enough to incorporate some of the elements of our current media that are required to really permeate people's consciousness and attention, but at the same time to offer a message that transcends just the mechanism, that transcends just appealing to the, as you were saying, appealing to the fear and appealing to the most base instincts. And I think it's possible. I think we can have a substantive message that transcends the atomization, but at the same time utilizes elements of current media to reach people in the most effective way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say that in addition, just that that the fear is selling, and it's atomizing us, it's individualizing us, and it's tribalizing us. And there is in the human spirit and the great and wonderful capacities, but we also have the capacity to see other people as not human. Mm-hmm. And so we're kind of having difficulty recognizing the human in other people right now. And those same kind of dynamics, although not with this very fractal, kaleidoscopic media situation, were evident in Egypt, were evident in first century Palestine, and were evident in 7th century Arabia. And what Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad basically said was that there's no way around the pain that they were in, but there was a way through it. And that was to recognize that there was one creator of all people, and therefore we're all related. And number 2, to learn to love your neighbor as you love yourself, which doesn't mean not to love yourself. It doesn't mean not to advocate for your own needs, but it means to recognize that we're all part of something bigger. And right now we've all been told that there's only so much pie left because the wealthy have taken most of it, and we're all like relegated to fighting for a small sliver of the pie. And that is not the reality we have to live in. But I think it's going to take a great sense of faith and work on the part of many different communities, faith and non-faith alike, to help us learn to love our neighbor as we love ourselves again in this time.
From just to add, from a Jewish perspective,
Yeah.
you hit right on it. In order to truly love another person the way that they deserve to be loved, we really have to learn to love ourselves first if we're going to use that as a point of reference.
And I will add that from the Islamic perspective, we're taught that fear is from the devil. So this idea that this fear, and to understand that it has a purpose, the fear that is being sort of around us through media and through otherwise, it serves a political purpose, it serves a profit purpose. There are these reasons that we are seeing this fear being spread and money made off of that fear, and political decisions made as a result of people's fears. So I think it's so incumbent on us, especially as faith leaders, as faith communities, to spread the message that love is greater than fear, because that's certainly what our faith traditions teach us, and to really be that example. So I hear you, Rabbi Danny, when you talk about sort of needing a president who says this message, but I say we're not responsible for somebody else's behavior. From my perspective, that's incumbent on us. And I know we're doing that. We have to stand up and speak out against the fear, and we have to help people, our fellow Americans, understand how this fear is being manipulated. Specifically with anti-Muslim sentiment, there's an entire industry, what's been dubbed the Islamophobia industry. It is an entire industry of groups and individuals who profit off of this kind of fear-mongering, the scapegoating, spreading misinformation and conspiracy theories against Muslims to get our fellow Americans to fear somebody who looks like me, when I don't think I have much, there's not much of I don't scare too many people, but apparently I do, right? But really giving people that ability to get to know each other. Learn to love your neighbor exactly as Islam teaches, Christianity teaches, Judaism teaches. This is what we have to do, and this is why it's so great that we're here together, having this conversation together and helping speak to our fellow Americans.
Well, you brought up a very good point, all of you, and that is that there is that fear, that sense of unsettlement that sits within all these people. There has been a lot of change now, but there's also that level of fear that's being injected by other levels for economic or political gain. How do you bridge over those messages? Is there a way to get to people, not simply that may fear any one of us because we're different, but that actively hate and want to do us harm? How do you reach those people?
Well, there's a magazine here, published in the Northwest, Yes magazine. I've been reading and finding reasons for hope. There's an article on Cuba that registered with me. We have some difficulties with Cuba politically, but here's what Cuba is doing. It's taking people from poor countries, bringing them to Cuba and train them as doctors and sending back to these poor countries to take care of their people. This is the kind of vision we need to keep in mind and focus on rather than negative. So when I see positive things like that, to renew my hope, to rekindle the light in me.
Anyone else want to touch on that?
Sure, I'll add that when people are scared, when we have this fear as we do right now, facts and statistics and data and reality is not necessarily going to change people's hearts and minds. The way we change hearts and minds is through personal connections, is through stories, through the sort of humanizing stories, those positive stories. So that's what I tell people is one of the greatest things they can do to combat Islamophobia or other forms of fear that we have, irrational fear in our country. One of the greatest things people can do is talk about the lives and contributions of the American Muslims that they know. Help humanize a community that is being demonized, that is being dehumanized as a result of the fear and the scapegoating and other things like that. Talk about those positive stories. And when you do that, when people get the chance to connect on a positive level, well, I always invite people to come to our mosque, come visit us at MAPS in Redmond. We welcome anybody to come spend some time with us, get to know some Muslims, learn a little bit about Islam. That is the way to really counter the fear. And one of the most powerful things people can do is write a letter to the editor or use sort of mainstream media to amplify this message and the stories of positivity, of hope, of positive contributions of by American Muslims that they know. That's really one of the most powerful tools that every single one of us has, and we could potentially reach millions of our fellow Americans, especially at a time when most Americans do not know much about Islam and do not personally know a Muslim. So it's easy to spread the fear in that kind of scenario.
I've been going all over Western Washington and encouraging churches and synagogues and Islamic centers and mosques and Hindu temples and atheist groups just to get together and not to try to resolve theological or philosophical differences, nor even to share that much about their own tradition, but rather just to simply be human with each other. So eat together and play together and tell stories with each other and do some good in their local community together. And that sort of capacity to bring people together, get people to sit down and eat, hold each other's babies while someone's going to go get a second plate of food. I mean, that changes things. And I think this is a real opportunity for people at all levels as individuals to reach out and do that. So when you have a party, don't just invite people that you know, invite someone that you don't know very well who may be a little bit different. For faith communities and for community groups, when they arrange events to get a variety of folk in that room. And it's amazing how just being in that room with folk that you think are so different from you, but in reality, they're just human beings, really helps you to recognize that the fear you've been sold is not worth the price of it. It's costing us our common humanity.
I mean, I think what we're really talking about is appealing to people's hearts rather than their heads. There's a scientist, a social scientist who wrote a very powerful book that came out a couple years ago called The Righteous Mind, that basically attributes the incredible divide that we have over politics, religion, and everything else to the fact that people really make decisions based oftentimes on gut impulse. Now, for better or for worse, it's just how we human beings are hardwired. And sometimes once those feelings are so intractably held, any facts, logic, reason are really not going to make a difference. What you need to do, beautifully spoken by my colleagues here, is find opportunities to have some real personal human time with people, evoking feelings, connecting on an emotional level, and most importantly, I think, understanding that what other people want, people who seem to be so foreign and so exotic to us, it's the same thing that we want. We want a good life for ourselves, for our children, we want to live in good neighborhoods, we want good schools. And again, I think appealing to those higher issues that all of us aspire to, and within this country and our political system that is somewhat centralized. Absolutely it should come from the grassroots and it should percolate from below, but I think it needs to be concerted and it needs to be distilled and concentrated from above, and we need that kind of message. We need a leadership that better reflects the true heart and soul of what America is about.
Absolutely.
You think part of that is people have stood back thinking it will all work out all right, and that in fact this may be a good motivation to realize things won't be all right if I stand back, but you need to involve yourself personally?
I mean, I think it's somewhat different. I think people are just so overwhelmed by the immensity of what's going on, and so fatigued by the daily up and down of the latest transgression or the latest breach of law, or whatever it is, that people are just kind of, stepping back and saying, I just can't deal with it anymore. And I understand that to a certain extent, but if we allow ourselves to become that inured, that is, as you were saying, that is exactly what it takes for evil to propagate and to spread, is for good, decent people to have had enough or to pull back. And I think we have to really resist that, because the stakes are too high for ourselves, let alone our children and grandchildren.
Yeah.
You've each alluded to some possibilities. Let me ask you, at the beginning of the program, we said, was there one instance, one example that really struck you as being terribly disturbing of where we're at? Do each of you carry with you an image of something that you've witnessed or heard about that really gives you hope?
I can tell you one. First of all, I'm impressed by my colleagues talking about the importance of getting to know one another, especially you, Amelia, to get to know Muslims. I think it's extremely important. This is a story of how, when you meet people, how very negative things can happen. A priest who was a medic in the Nazi army in Russia was bringing back some severely wounded German soldiers. He came to a Russian farmhouse. He had to get them in out of the freezing cold. So he knocked on the door and asked, could they shelter these 2 German soldiers? Well, they were very hesitant, because if the word got out, their life would be taken. Finally, they agreed to take them. He said, just give them water. In the morning, when he went to get them, he found this Russian couple had stayed up all night and made soup for the German soldiers. Well, he was quite taken by this. I didn't ask you to do that, he said. The woman spoke up and said, I have a son in the Russian army fighting on the German front. If he was this injured in Germany, I believe a German mother would care for him. So compassion, meeting face to face, turned her from being anti-German, anti-Nazis, into showing compassion for them. That's why I agree with my colleagues that getting to know one another as people, getting to know you, Amelia, is just your background, your family, and so on, changes my attitude. It's not an intellectual thing, but as a person to person.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say that, what people are falling into, and I agree with what Rabbi Danny said, is despair. Fatigue and despair, and that's dangerous territory to be in. It's really important. I know for me personally, my faith teaches me the hope and optimism that I need. I think it's a disservice to previous leaders who came in, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, and others who came before us who faced difficult circumstances as well. I think it's unfair to them to say that we lose hope. We cannot lose hope. And what I see every day in the work that I do with the wonderful people that I get to work with, I see that hope. I see reason for that strength and inspiration that I can draw from other people coming together and saying, I will not stand for this. The example I gave in the beginning was our mosque sign being vandalized twice in less than a month. And the specific response, even though those acts by individuals, they were acts of hatred, we had an outpouring of individual and communal manifestations of love and solidarity and coming together. People who had never walked into a mosque before. When that happened, they came to us and they said, we do not agree with this. This does not represent us. We stand with you. And to have that kind of communal support and solidarity, that was powerful. That was sort of a way that we show that love is far greater than hate. And we have many other examples too. I helped start this, I talked to some attorneys who started this campaign called 5 Minutes in light of the response of somebody, Ted Hakey Jr. I don't know if you guys have heard of him, but he lived next door to a mosque and he shot his rifle one day. He had said a lot of anti-Muslim things, and one day he decided to heed his own advice. He took his rifle, shot into the next door mosque, unfortunately. Fortunately, even though that was a horrible incident, fortunately, he went back. The mosque invited him to come back and meet with them. When he did that, he said something to them that was so powerful. He said that he had never sort of walked into that mosque. If he had actually spent 5 minutes with them, with the Muslim community there, he would have never done what he had done. That's that power of that individual the connection, that human connection, getting to know each other. It can have a profound difference. Not only can it stop hate crimes, but it can show us the power of love over hate.
So after the election, I went in to meet with a friend of mine who works at my wife's hospital where she works, and she was 5 months pregnant. And so I kind of talked to her. She's a Muslim woman. Talked to her and just told her, hey, I just want you to know I'm thinking about you this week and I want you to hang in there, and how are you feeling? And she began to say how she wasn't sure that the brown baby that she was carrying was going to be welcomed in the world. And so we just there in the hallway just kind of hugged each other for a few minutes. Well, this last June, after that mosque and a synagogue and a whole bunch of churches and other faith communities in Bellingham, Washington, came together for an Eid celebration. And I got to stand up in front of this group holding this little baby whose name is Layla. And she's a beautiful little baby. And I just shared how when I was talking to Nasreen in the hallway, I said, I think you don't know how many friends you have. I think there are way more people that are going to stand with you than you can possibly imagine. And it was so wonderful to stand in front of those people who had organized and envisioned and brought this wonderful event together, and were being human with each other. And I think that kind of event, those kind of events, those kind of relationships are happening all across Western Washington, and they're happening all across this country. And I think that we may not see it covered in the media, but I believe that a tide of hate and fear is happening, but I also see a wave of love and respect and neighborliness happening as well.
Very, very briefly, because there are so many to choose from, and three that come to mind. One is I took a recent trip to Abu Dhabi at the invitation of the United Arab Emirates government, and really co-sponsored by a megachurch evangelical minister in Dallas who felt that he took responsibility on himself and kind of his whole evangelical group for fomenting a lot of Islamophobia. It brought together rabbis, imams, and pastors with some incredible scholars in the United Arab Emirates. And just the spirit of reconciliation and working together was powerful, and we're bringing it back here. Secondly, I took a trip at the invitation of the German government for rabbis, and just not only seeing the way in which they confront their past and seek to repair the damage that they've done, but the incredible way that the country of Germany is truly a light unto the nations in terms of an example of welcoming in refugees and the most vulnerable is critical. And lastly, we just recently rededicated the space that had been defiled. As with maps, right after the event happened, we got literally thousands of responses from people from all over the world telling us, whoever did this represents a minority. The Jewish community is loved locally and around the world, so please don't take this as an indication of anything. And we just dedicated a beautiful mural that reaffirms the values of peace, love, connection, and blessing that are so critical.
We could go over so much more if we had time, but unfortunately we're at the end of our time. But I'd like to thank each of you for participating in this and hopefully giving people watching some idea of what they can do. And it seems like one of the best things they could do is take that risk, reach out a hand, and go visit, get to know somebody that you really don't know. Our thanks to those of you watching us, and you can watch this program or suggest some topics for the future use by joining our website, www.tracylevine.org. We invite you to join the group, join the conversation. Thank you again for joining us.